Welcome Year 12 to this video on the second part of Father and Child by Gwen Harwood entitled Nightfall. Make sure that you have your poetry booklet with you so that you can do your annotations as you watch this video, and make sure that you pause and rewind and rewatch as needed. Okay, so let's go over the main ideas and style of this poem, Nightfall. So like Barn Owl, this is from Selected Poems 1975. So what we need to know about Nightfall is that it is a poem that uses the same characters as from Barn Owl, but it is many years later. So the characters in this poem are when the child persona from Barn Owl is an adult and the father is approaching the end of his life. So the main ideas that are explored are about shifting relationships over time, specifically the father-child relationship. So how that relationship changes over the course of a life and how it impacts both the identity of the father and the child. So the idea that we were introduced in Barn Owl about kind of coming to understand mortality and death continues into Nightfall. But this is a deepening understanding of aging and death. And the new perspective that we get in Nightfall is that mortality and aging and death can be both beautiful and devastating. Okay, so that's obviously a deepening kind of understanding, or a changing understanding from what we got in Barn Owl. The idea of the transience, the fragility of human life, and the need to accept the limits of human agency is also explored here. So what I hope that you're seeing is that lots of the kind of ideas that were introduced in Barn Owl are continued and then developed and kind of deepened in Nightfall, okay? So we get a kind of childlike understanding of a lot of these issues in Barn Owl, and then a more kind of mature perspective on these aspects of human life in Nightfall. And there's a kind of celebration of the enduring nature of love and memory in Nightfall as well. It is kind of a much more positive kind of celebratory poem compared to Barn Owl. So style and form, this is also a narrative poem, but it's much more reflective and contemplative in tone compared to Barn Owl. So whereas Barn Owl kind of follows that really strong narrative of the child going out and shooting the owl, the narrative of Nightfall is really just the father and child going for a walk. Okay, so it is a narrative, there is an event happening, but mostly it's reflection and contemplation throughout. First person perspective continues. It's the child from Barn Owl, but now they are an adult. Cycle of a day continues. We see that even in the title. Same structure and rhythm, so 7 sestets with that consistent rhyme pattern continue in Nightfall. But the kind of new aspect of style that we really get strongly in Nightfall is this use of intertextuality and allusion. So that's going to continue. We're going to see that again and again now in the remainder of the Harwood poems we look at. But we get strong kind of biblical allusions through Nightfall, and then also a repeated kind of intertextual reference and allusion to Shakespeare's play King Lear in this poem as well. So the title, Nightfall. So obviously we're going to be doing a lot of kind of contrasting and juxtaposing with Barn Owl. So Barn Owl is set at daybreak. Nightfall is in the evening. So we've got literal movement of time forward in the persona's life, represented through that movement in time and the setting of the poems. Obviously, metaphorically, Nightfall is going to represent the end of life. The word fall, I think, does a few things. it's not night, it's nightfall. So that's also a kind of a period of transition. So just like barn owl, there was that transition from childhood to adulthood. Nightfall is really about the transition from life to death. Okay. And the word fall there suggests a kind of like inevitability, the uncontrollable passing of time, that night is always going to fall. Okay. Human life is always going to end. Okay, let's get into the poem now. So I'm going to read the stanzas to you and then point out a couple of the important language and stylistic features. 40 years, lived or dreamed, what memories pack them home, that seemed incredible to come. Father and child, we stand in time's long promised land. Since there's no more to taste, ripeness is plainly all. Father, we pick our last fruits of the temporal. 80 years old, you take this late walk for my sake. Who can be what you were? Link your dry hand in mine, my stick-thin comforter. Far distant suburbs shine with great simplicities. Birds crowd in flowering trees. Okay, so 40 years lived or dreamed, what memories pack them home. So we know that time has passed, 40 years. I've heard some people say that this is like when the persona is 40 years old, or maybe it's 40 years following kind of the events of Barn Owl. It doesn't really matter. We just know that there is a leap forward in time here, and it's a substantial leap forward. So the persona is saying here that their 40 years have been either lived or dreamed. Okay, so this is a paradox. They're saying, like, have I actually lived this, or has this all been a dream? And it kind of introduces some uncertainty about memory. Okay, and its reliability, but also kind of captures, I think, the surreal kind of experience of time passing. That you know that your whole life has passed, but it kind of feels almost like a dream, the past. Okay, so I think that paradox really captures that surreal kind of feeling of time passing. And then we get the personification of memory, what memories pack them home. So this is obviously positioning memory as kind of a bridge between the past and the present, because memory is bringing the 40 years home. Okay, so there's a sense that whether he lived or dreamed them, it's memory that connects him to his past, or her. We don't really know the gender. Okay, the next thing I want to point out is that just all of this kind of like extended metaphor, all of the imagery that relates to harvest and to fruit and to seasons. So we have the season, later we have talk of ripeness of fruit, picking fruit. So there's all this extended kind of imagery around harvest time and around seasons. So there's a few things happening here. This is a biblical allusion to Ecclesiastes 3, which is that kind of famous passage about there's a season for this and a season for that. Okay, definitely go and read that if you're not kind of familiar with that passage. But the idea here is that kind of time passes in kind of an inevitable but orderly way that is controlled by God, but is beyond human control. Okay, so you can't control the season of life you're in. That is beyond kind of the limits of human agency. It's like this inevitable, your life is going to pass in an inevitable way, like the seasons pass. Okay. But kind of describing it as seasons and like picking fruit and things like that is also like, I would say, quite a positive framing of that. It's not a negative thing, okay? There's kind of this sense that this passing of seasons with the picking of the fruit is not something that needs to be kind of mourned, okay, for the father. So, father and child, we stand, and then he kind of repeats, or she kind of repeats this kind of sort of phrase, father, we pick, a couple of times throughout the poem. So every time that the persona refers to the father as father or themselves as child, it's really positioning the people's identity as being in their relationship with each other. Okay, we talked about this even just in terms of the title, but that's kind of important. The other thing I would say is important here is that use of kind of collective inclusive language. So father and child, we stand, we pick our last fruits. So there's this sense that they are in relationship and there's a unity between the father and child. Think about that in contrast to what we got in Barnow. Okay, so there's a sense that, like, with maturity and with time passing, there's been a strengthening in their relationship. And where do they stand? In time's long promised land. So this is a metaphor and a biblical allusion. So the allusion to the promised land being that the land that God promised the Israelites in the Old Testament. But this is time's long promised land. So there's a sense that there's kind of an acknowledgement and an acceptance that this end of life was always going to come. It was inevitable. But by framing it as kind of the promised land from the Bible, that is a positive, again, a positive framing, okay, of the approach to death. And that's same, I think, with what we get with the kind of seasonal imagery, okay, that this is not something that needs to be feared, okay. Since there's no more to taste, ripeness is plainly all. Okay, so this is the first kind of allusion, intertextual reference we get to King Lear. So King Lear, the play, is about a father's relationship with his three daughters and the changing nature of that relationship. So there's obviously a parallel there between Lear and what we're getting in father and child. And King Lear's kind of final words in the play are ripeness is all. So that's mirrored, echoed in what Harwood is writing here, ripeness is plainly all. So ripeness refers to kind of symbolically being ready for death, okay, right, like the ripening of fruit, okay, it's ready to be picked, it's ready to die. And we'll just kind of park that reference to King Lear here, and we'll kind of continue looking at how that develops across the rest of the poem. But that's kind of all we need to know for now. Jumping down to the last stanza on this slide, we get this lovely rhetorical question, who can be what you were? Link your dry hands in mine, my stick thin comforter. So that rhetorical question and the metaphor of being the stick thin comforter highlights the current perspective of the child towards the father, okay? And the perspective is that the father is irreplaceable to the child, who can be what you were. And they continue to be a comforter, okay, with that metaphor, the comforter. I think it's interesting, just we get these echoes from Barn Owl, okay? Remember the end of Barn Owl, we have the child crying on the shoulder of the father, so he's the comforter, and he continues to be the comforter even, you know, in this late stage of his life. So that identity for the father as the comforter of the child is something that is sustained throughout the life, throughout their relationship. And then we have the birds crowd in flowery trees. So this is both a continuation of kind of this positive natural imagery that we've got throughout these first three stanzas, and that is also going to continue on throughout the rest of the poem. Sunset exalts its known symbols of transience. Your passionate face is grown to ancient innocence. Let us walk for this hour as if death had no power or no more than sleep. Things truly named can never vanish from earth. You keep a child's delight forever in birds, flowers, shivery grass. I name them as we pass. Okay, so this, the first stanza here opens with this Sunset exalts its known symbols of transience, okay? So here, the persona is actually kind of spelling out the fact that sunset is a symbol of transience, or the passing of time, the idea that life is temporary and fleeting. So just like the sun kind of sets, and it's inevitable and it happens and it's a fleeting moment, so is human life, okay? The interesting word here is exalts, okay, which suggests that that kind of passing of time and the fleeting nature of time is something that is to be celebrated, okay? It's exalted, something to be praised. So again, we're getting this sense here that the perspective on mortality and life and death is not that mortality is something that needs to be feared, but rather it's something that makes life more beautiful, okay? The fact that it's fleeting. Your passionate face is grown to ancient innocence. So here we've got the juxtaposition between ancient and innocence. So the father who's being described here is positioned as both old and wise, but also childlike. And this is positioning life as being circular. So there's a sense that there's a continuation between childhood and adulthood. And that also, I think that the father's identity as a child kind of continues into adulthood and is not something that's lost. And I think we get kind of echoes back to the violets here, right? That idea that even in adulthood, childhood doesn't have to be something that's lost, okay? But that there's beauty in kind of childhood innocence, and that's something that you can kind of take into your adult identity. I think that idea is being echoed here. We get the continuation of the inclusive language with "let us walk for this hour," as if death had no power or were no more than sleep. So we've got a simile here, as if death had no power, and then also the euphemism of calling death sleep. So I think that there is both of those techniques, saying that death doesn't have any power, or as if, so it's a simile, or the euphemism of calling death sleep, suggests a sense of acceptance of death and a kind of peaceful understanding of the fact that death is coming, and that there's kind of an acceptance of mortality here, okay? And then we get this kind of really philosophical assertion kind of in the middle of the poem. Things truly named can never vanish from earth. So I think that, again, there's some ambiguity in what Harwood is saying here. Things truly named, what's she talking about here? I think that there's a sense that she's saying that language, memory, things that we talk about with each other, things that we talk truthfully about, that act of remembering and talking and using language preserves things even after they physically disappear. So I think that to me anyway, I think she's talking about the father here, things truly named. The true name of him was Father. That was his identity. And in remembering the father, he doesn't vanish from the child. But I think that's a good one to kind of also discuss with your class. You keep a child's delight forever in birds, flowers, shivery grass. I name them as we pass. So that use of the I name them is again kind of, it's a repeating of the idea from that assertion that things truly named can never vanish from earth. But you keep a child's delight forever in birds, flowers, shivery grass is again an echo of what we saw with the ancient innocence. So that kind of sensory natural imagery is suggesting that the father's kind of sense of wonder at life and at the natural world has helped maintain him in his old age. And again, I would say this is an echo back to the ideas of that we saw in the violets as well, that our memories of things that we experienced as children help sustain us as we grow older. Be your tears wet. You speak as if air touched a string near breaking point. Your cheek brushes on mine. Old king, your marvelous journey's done. Your night and day are one, as you find with your white stick the path on which you turn home, with the child once quick to mischief, grown to learn what sorrows in the end no words, no tears can mend. Okay, so be your tears wet here. So the father is asking the child whether they're crying. But this is an intertextual reference again to King Lear. So this is a line from King Lear when Lear is reconciling with his daughter Cordelia. Okay. The other reference that we get to King Lear here is when the persona calls the father Old King. Okay. So I'd love you to talk, especially if you are in advanced English and you studied King Lear last term, right? You might have some really good insights into what you think is happening with the constant allusions to King Lear. What is Harwood kind of communicating through that? I don't think we need to know heaps about King Lear to understand this or have an interpretation, but it's the idea of kind of by referencing King Lear, Harwood is reinforcing that this is a poem about aging. It's about confronting your mortality, and it's about the changing relationship between fathers and their children, because that's what the play King Lear is about. Okay, so she's putting her kind of poem in that kind of literary tradition of exploring these ideas. But if you've studied King Lear in detail, you might have kind of some deeper insight into that you might want to discuss with your class. You speak as if air touched a string near breaking point. So I think this is a really beautiful simile. It's communicating that the father's voice is near breaking. Maybe it's like a whisper. And it's suggesting the physical kind of frailty, but also emotional vulnerability within their relationship. Okay, that he's asking the child, are you crying? But it's in like this whisper voice. Okay. And that idea of closeness is continued through the physical imagery. Your cheek brushes on mine. Think about that verb choice of brush, suggesting closeness, gentleness within the relationship. This is a very different relationship compared to the one we saw in Barn Owl. So think about how the passage of time, the experience of growing up has transformed their relationship. Your night and day are one. Okay, so we've got a metaphor here, the night being death and the day being life, and the persona is saying that you are approaching death. Okay, your day is becoming night. Okay, but it's a kind of, again, a metaphor that suggests like acceptance rather than resistance to that fact. Okay, there's this sense of completion to the father's life. As you find with your white stick, the path on which you turn home. So the white stick is obviously symbolizing the father's literal blindness. So he's using kind of a stick to find his way, but it also suggests a role reversal and again, a transformation in their relationship. Remember in Barn Owl, it is the father who acts as kind of a guide to the child as they are entering into maturity. Now the father needs a guide, a white stick, to help him find his way. So there's a sense that as time passes, roles are reversed, roles are transformed. You turn home with the child once quick to mischief, grown to learn. So here is a reference back to Barn Owl and the mischievous child, the juxtaposition of quick to mischief, grown to learn, positions growing up as a process of gaining knowledge and gaining understanding. That once you are mischievous, the process of growing up is one of learning. And what do you learn? You learn what sorrows in the end no words, no tears can mend. So I think this is a really kind of interesting end to this poem because there's a real to me, a real shift in tone here. We've talked about the fact that throughout lots of this poem, there seems to be a sort of acceptance of death, but the ending is really one of mourning, okay, and grief, because sorrows can't be mended. So again, I think it's ambiguous. I think you can talk about your interpretation of what the ending of this poem means. I think that we can say that it ends in acknowledging kind of the limits of human agency and language, because remember we've talked already about the fact that this poem has at points talked about the fact that language can preserve things, but in the final lines it says that words can't mend certain sorrows. So there's a kind of acknowledgement that even emotion, tears, even memory, even language can't preserve everything, okay? There is a limit to human agency, there is a limit to human language, and all of those things can't prevent loss and death and grief, okay? So again, there's lots of complexity here. It's not one thing or the other. There's a complexity in the emotion being represented here, that there is kind of beauty in death, but also sorrow in aging, and there's always going to be a fracturing of relationships because of human mortality, and that is something to be kind of grieved, I think, is what Harwood is saying at the conclusion of this poem. But I think that shift in tone at the end is something that I'd love you to unpack with your class and think about how you interpret kind of this poem holistically, what you think the poem is saying about those experiences of growing up, those experiences of kind of learning and acknowledging death and human mortality. All right, I will leave you there. Thank you, Year 12.